Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of PLASTICAST, the Pacific Northwest Consortium on Plastics podcast. And joining me today is beach ranger Ryan Parker, who is based in Newport, Oregon, to talk about plastic marine debris washing up on Oregon shores. Thanks for joining us, Ryan.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. So I'm a native Oregonian. I grew up in Multnomah County, over close to Sandy, Oregon, which is along the Sandy River there, and grew up with a love of the environment and a bunch of meanders. I went to Oregon State for a while, management information systems, and I transferred to U of O. And at U of O, I was doing some minor program work in outdoor recreation, which led me to end up in the Berkshires. And then I was teaching English overseas for a number of years and looking for some stability. And my sibling works for Oregon State Parks and has for a long time. And so he convinced me to apply. And in 2007, I got a job at Beverly Beach and worked there as a campground ranger for a number of years. And then one of the original beach ranger, back when there was just, the coast was divided by two. So one person was covering Astoria to Newport and one person was covering Newport to Brookings, which, as you might imagine, is relatively thin coverage. But at the time, that's what the budget allowed. And so I got the original beach ranger's job basically after he retired in 2011. And in amongst those 10 years were some significant occurrences. For example, the 3/11/11 tsunami. And that day that happened, when the wave got to Oregon, I was working at the Depot Bay Whale Watch Center and saw the waves coming in and covered the Depot Bay seawall, which is something I have only seen that one time. And it was really, they incurred a lot of damage at their commercial docks. And then so didn't think much of it. And then the following June, in June of 2012, that big fish processing dock from Misawa washed up. And that was kind of the beginning of the interest from the public and our agency response to tsunami marine debris. The legislature has engaged with our department and seen the value of what beach rangers do and has allowed the department to add positions. And from when I started, there were 3 of us and it became 5. And I believe there's 8 positions now. Still, Oregon's model of removing marine debris off the public beach is different than other states, but I think it's a good model that other states could emulate under their own legal framework in their state, right? The 3/11/11 earthquake and tsunami really did elevate the global. It was the biggest global catalyst to talk about the problem of marine debris that I've ever seen. And I think the academic interest and the local government interest in it, it's recognized as an economic threat as well as an environmental threat. And I think before the Tohoku earthquake, it wasn't on people's radars as far as ocean planning, but I do feel like it really brought that to the forefront.
I've only lived in Oregon for about 3 years now. It's interesting to think about that earthquake and that dock event being somewhat of a catalyst for the public expanding their awareness on marine debris. And I suppose, we've been managing marine debris in various capacities since then, but I'm wondering if you've noticed any trends among the amount of plastic collected or the plastic type, or perhaps specific coastal sites where the plastic tends to be deposited.
It is site specific. It is weather pattern specific. Between about Thanksgiving and Memorial Day is what we consider our debris season. So we get onshore flow, especially in May, west winds. And then between, early winter and late spring, we get southwesterly flow coming up from the California current and the open ocean. And that gets pushed across the longshore currents by storm systems. And so there's more debris that accumulates based on the frequency and the severity of storms. So like last winter, we had a couple of storms. A lot of the debris was foreign. A lot of it was local, depending on how close to the beach you were, for example. But what we have is a lot of stairways being wiped out from wave activity when the people that own vacation homes, they'll leave them out and then a sideways wave comes and knocks it off the blocks or whatever. So you get a lot of that localized debris, but it's a ton of debris from, all the ships that are out there fishing beyond Oregon's territorial sea, and the UN can create policies and protocols, but the enforceability component is the biggest hindrance on a global response to plastic pollution. That obviously goes beyond what state parks would do. So we're very hemmed in between extreme low tide and extreme high tide, but we need countries to work together, and we need a national strategy, and I think that's coming. But part of the problem is there's only 15 or 16 states that have coastline on the ocean, whether it's the Atlantic or the Pacific. Yet plastic pollution persists in other areas, in freshwater bodies. The Great Lakes have a microplastic problem big time, but a comprehensive state strategy is kind of what state parks came up with as a partner to the Oregon Marine Debris Response Plan. And a lot of that was just department protocol that was brought up to other agencies and combined into more of a cohesive strategy. But the end user of that plan is our department, and the end, I wouldn't call them producers, but the end active body of that plan is our beach ranger program. So we have the opportunity, because the beach is under our jurisdiction, to drive out there and access the beach in areas where it's safe and convenient and pick up the larger debris. Like, there's always issues that use their time, and they don't have the time to go out and do the tedious work, and it is tedious. And also, Oregon has a geomorphological, is that a word?
Yeah, I think you got it.
Limitation on wet sand versus dry sand, because you can't either hand or mechanically sift wet sand, right? It'll destroy whatever machine you'd use. And a few companies have offered to do, those types of sand sifting machine demos. And the last time they came out, they were up in Pacific County in Washington, and they drove the machine out in Long Beach, and it broke down in probably 30 minutes. And I mean, these are $1 million pieces of equipment, and they need dry, sun-dried, coarse sand like they have in Southern California, like they have in Hawaii. Mechanically solving a problem that is a systemic human problem all over the world maybe isn't. It needs to be more about reduction of inputs. Like that's what 5-Gyro says. That's what Al Galita always talks about, reducing inputs. So, that's kind of outside of the scope of what our department does. But prior to COVID, I did do a lot of, evening programs at campgrounds talking about that sourcing and how most of the debris is from land, and how the harms that plastic causes in the marine environment, and how by removing bigger debris, we're preventing it from photodegrading and becoming smaller debris. So we are taking that active role, but the consumer plastics and the waste dumping and all that is like, there's no one agency in Oregon that has been tasked by the legislature to do that work, because I don't know that the legislature has had the time or had the political interest in addressing that holistically, because it's so complicated. I've shown a lot of the field reps for Surfrider where the largest, most accessible microplastic areas are loaded into the beach environment. And as you know, that's probably, well, in Lincoln County, it's creek beds. Creek beds get hammered here on this part of the coast in the winter. It just, as the sand, the sand migrates, and as the sand goes offshore, it dumps what plastic is already locked in the beach from the summer sand, and it brings in more from the open ocean, and it all kind of gets churned up. And a lot of the creeks that have plastic pollution problems on the Oregon coast are also salmonoid or, cutthroat trout bearing streams, which is why I spend the time as much as I can trying to get people to help clean those creeks out. But the main place for larger macro debris that all the rangers find and pick up and know are hotspots are south-facing headlands. And that's a literal cell issue, right? Because I think there's either 11 or 13 littoral cells along the Oregon coast, and most of them stop and end either at a jetty mouth or like Cape Blanco acts as one, or Cape Lookout is the best example because I've spent the most time there. So Cape Lookout and Cape Blanco are the two most westernmost points on the Oregon coast, and that divides the cell between the Netarts Base cell and the Cape Lookout, Sand Lake cell. There would be times where I'd go out to Sand Lake and there would just be 15 to 30 yards of debris every time I went out there. I mean, it was a significant jump, and at times it felt overwhelming, but in hindsight, I kind of liked it being that dirty because you have to look at it from the 10,000 foot view, and that the dirtier the beach is, the less that's in the active water column. So Sand Lake is a wide flat sand beach, and there are good invertebrate populations in that sand, razor clams, rock scallops closer to the Cape. But if we go and remove all those floats and nets and things, a lot of which those wrapped net and rope fragments are already pretty photodegraded when they come into shore because they've been out at sea for years. Just cutting those things, you loosen fibers, and it makes a mess, but not as much of a mess as if it sank on a reef, which they do. Oregon and the US has a economic driver and economic assets to remove marine debris, even in remote locations. Like there's only a few beaches in Oregon we can't get to by vehicle, and so those just persist, but it's not effective to go paddling on state time to clean a few micro beaches that you can't get to except a few times a year. But the state of Alaska has 3,000 miles of those beaches, and they clean 1 to 2% of their beaches a year. And so Oregon's well suited to manage what Oregon gets, but there's a lot of places we got to recognize need economic assistance. The line item marine debris budgets for NOAA and the freighters they rent and all that is they pick the worst of the worst places, but there's more that needs to be cleaned. And if Oregon State Parks, for example, had a Zodiac, we would probably find these micro populations of debris that we can't physically get to, but we just don't have those resources. Anyway, so south-facing headlands and river mouths and creeks, those are what's loaded, and those are high water table sites. And I'd say the last 2 years were lower debris loads than the previous 5 or 6 that I directly experienced, for sure. Just no southwesterly flow, no westerly winds strong enough to push that open ocean garbage across the surf break. It just stays out there, basically, is kind of how the transport mechanism is.
So my research has to do with micro and nano tire particles as well as the leachate. And we're actually just running a big month-long experiment looking at artificially photodegraded tire particles and their associated leachate. And I'm wondering, have you read or heard about that paper that just came out in, I think, in January, looking at how the tire leachate has been activated by UV light to have quinone that's killing the coho salmon? Do you know about that?
No, but send me that paper and
Yeah.
I'll try to wrap my head around it. I have read a number of articles in mainstream media about tire degradation, and you can, when you find tires that have been in the ocean a while, you could see how the rubber sort of decomposes in a way where it makes this black grime around the outside and inside of the tire, inside especially. And so we find, vehicle tires, trailer spare tires with rims on. And then what we find a lot of are repurposed utility vehicle tires that have styrofoam sprayed into them as well, we'll call them low budget dock floats. And the west coast of Oregon and Washington, there's a lot of that dock material out there, some active, but mostly derelict, that's breaking off, and that foam is going down rivers. And they use those a lot in shellfish farming, those foam filled tires. And not only do they become rafts of wild invertebrates that grow in those brackish areas, but I always have to remember to wear gloves when you pick up tires out of the ocean, because your hands will turn black from all the degraded, especially the ones that have been out there a long time. So that I would certainly recognize that tire pollution is a societal wide issue that I would guess would be prone to some redesign by the tire manufacturers to use different materials that may be less toxic than what they're using now.
Yeah, we look at sublethal things like behavioral and ingestion endpoints, and turns out mysid shrimp and inland silverside fish will in fact ingest tire particles.
A little bird told me that mysids are the main food source for gray whales.
Yeah, which leads me to my next question is, beyond the filter feeding invertebrates and oyster farms and things like that, have you all noticed or found wildlife like such as whales with lots of plastic or nets or things like that in them?
I found that northern fur seals and Guadalupe fur seals are the two marine mammals I've actually dealt with that were actually entangled. Both of them were in trawl nets, and both set. So there was one trawl net that washed up in Seal Rock a couple years ago. There was two juvenile female Guadalupe fur seals in there. And then there was one that washed up at Agate Beach this year. It was a juvenile northern fur seal that was also in a trawl net. And that was a double overhand knot tie. So that's not used by our local fishery. Most of the heavy accumulation of derelict net occurs in the shallow part of the Pacific Ocean, like in the coral reefs and stuff like that, more so than in our part of the world. But I do know that I have personally picked up local trawl nets on the beach, but it's increasingly rare. The trawling fleet in Newport has done a good job of redesign to prevent snagging, and they have like a lot of science going into that at Hatfield as far as making nets that are environmentally friendly as they can be.
Ryan, do you know if there are any plastic reduction ordinances in Newport or along the Oregon coast, or are they kind of being developed now?
There are a couple of so the city of Florence passed this polystyrene takeout food ban in 2017. I believe that was the first place along the coast that did that. Before COVID, I think Lincoln City banned styrofoam containers just because of the blight and the litterability of the product. The two overriding nonprofits that do the most work on outreach, about marine debris is obviously Solve is a state-funded nonprofit, and then donation-funded nonprofit, the biggest one is Surfrider Foundation. There's a very active chapter here, and that filled a huge need in the community in southern and central Tillamook County, because like I said, Sand Lake and Cape Lookout on both sides, all the way out to Neatart Spit, get really heavy marine debris loads because of those places are at the opposite ends of their littoral cells, and the capes are like strainers, really. It's like a comb. They're combing the longshore current. Whatever debris makes it in there eventually lands. As a observer from my level, like, how long has this stuff been in the ocean? How long is it? It's hard to tell, and I guess that would be neat to see tracers put in these materials. And there's been a lot of talk of that, on a global scale of like, all right, Europe's got the green point system where it's consumer buyback at the point of purchase. That's a low hanging fruit that could be addressed. Making the plastic food containers, have a deposit on them or give them back to the grocery store that sells them. From my perspective anyway, that would reduce the overpackaging problem that creates, the issue of landfill space and all the other things surrounding consumer plastics. So there's lots to do, and I think most of the problems are pretty much, checking a box as to what the problem is. It's just a matter of finding the lowest cost solution. But I feel like that's what we've done with the Beach Ranger program, is recognize the threat to wildlife, recognize the threat to recreation, and remove the item. It's not ideal that some of it's landfilled, almost. And it's not ideal there aren't great ways to recycle plastic ropes, but that's a design problem. What it's designed to do and how it's designed to be recycled or be downcycled, they're very different things. And I think that someone can make themselves a lot of money if they were able to figure out a way to, have pot lines that were more resistant to photo degradation, and therefore the fibers would be more easily recyclable.
Thank you, Ryan. You listed some really creative possibilities for how we might collectively approach this really complex problem. And just to wrap up, I'm wondering, is there anything that I've left out or that you would want Oregonians to know about marine debris and plastic waste reduction?
Gosh, there's a lot of things that people do have within their sphere of influence, and a lot of it is just knowing about the problem and figuring out ways that individual people or families or communities can improve their own environment. Get out and look in an estuary, look at roadsides, and once you start to see the litter, I have some bad news for you. You can't unsee it. However, you can start to see what you're up against. A waterway can only be scenic if it's clean and pristine, right? And so everyone has a shared interest in setting a higher standard for the cleanliness of not just coastal rivers, but rivers all over the state. And that really comes down to seeing what the problem is and figuring out a small way that you can reduce the problem. So I think that's probably the most empowering thing to look at it from that perspective.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for your time today. I appreciate you talking with me about all this stuff. And
we could certainly do a tour of some of these places I've been telling you about that are just within the area here. If you were to be here in the wintertime, you could start to see the connectivity between the marine debris that's stuck in the beach profile and the new arrivals, so to speak, and how they interact. It's pretty interesting. I like that you're studying an issue that is a land-based issue that's become an ocean-based issue. I think that crossover is important for people to get how holistic Earth systems are and how they are prone to what happens when human-caused disruption occurs at whatever scale one would say that it's occurring, and then what do we do in response? That's pretty important stuff to research.
Well, thanks so much, dude. I appreciate your time, and have a good rest of your week.
Yeah, good luck with your defense there.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yep, see ya.